thrilled to welcome you all to the third annual Research Symposium at the Center for Humanities Research at George Mason University. My name is Alison Landsberg, and I'm Professor of History and Cultural Studies and also the Director of this center. I want to begin by thanking Vice President Dr. Andre Marshall and the Office of Research, Innovation, and Economic Impact, and Dean Ann Artis in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences for their support of our Transdisciplinary Research Center. We're also grateful to our co-sponsors for this talk, the Departments of English, History and Art History, Modern and Classical Languages, Sociology and Anthropology and Philosophy, the Schar School for Government and Public Policy, and the Cultural Studies and Women and Gender Studies programs. I'd also like to thank the CHR Steering Committee, our exceptional GRA Christopher Stinson, and the CHR Associate Director, Catherine O'Lean, who has played a critical role in the planning of this event and in all that we do at the CHR. Our third annual research symposium takes as its subject our theme for the year, democracy, disposability, and repair. The contention here is that forms of disposability have been characteristic or even constitutive of modes of social and political life, past and present. And we mean disposability in its most capacious sense and at a range of scales, from the dispossession, relocation, and annihilation of local populations resulting from colonialism, the Atlantic slave trade, war-enforced migrations, environmental degradation, and climate change, to the displacements caused by urban gentrification. And by disposable, we hope to signal as well those whose voices have been suppressed or silenced in public and private spheres, as well as the systemic and/or state-sponsored efforts to erase cultures or communities. These and other forms of rendering people and places disposable haunt the world we inhabit, byproducts of capitalism. It seems all too clear that democratic modes of governance have been bound up with, perhaps even dependent upon, disposability, precarity, and extraction. And yet, we feel it urgent to ask, could democracy nevertheless, perhaps in a much more radical or not yet realized form, offer possibilities for resistance, reparation, and repair? We continue this year-long collective inquiry with our keynote address tonight and over the course of tomorrow's 3 panels, which begin at 9:15 a.m. just down the hall in Merton 1201. It's impossible to imagine a theorist whose work is more suited to engaging these questions than our esteemed keynote speaker, Nancy Fraser. And I want to express my gratitude to her for accepting this invitation. I first encountered her work in the 1990s as a graduate student studying the public sphere. Her brilliant rebuttal to Habermas, her careful theorization of subaltern counterpublics as a challenge to the exclusionary and sexist bourgeois public sphere was groundbreaking for me, and I think I can say for a whole generation of scholars, whose work was invested in understanding the appearance of actual politics in locations and social sites and among subordinated social groups previously considered outside the bounds of what might have legitimately been considered the political. My colleague Rachel Lewis, CHR Steering Committee member and Professor of Women and Gender Studies, will have the honor of introducing Nancy Fraser. Professor Lewis has expertise in feminist and queer theory, with a particular focus on ecofeminism and animal rights, human rights, race and immigration, and transnational sexuality. In addition to her numerous articles, most recently on queer deportability, the politics of lesbian anti-deportation activism, published in the journal Sexualities, and vulnerability, pleasure, and animal rights, published in the journal Women's Studies, she's working on a book-length manuscript about women, animals, and the feminization of interspecies care work, tentatively titled Feline Animacies, Interspecies Care and Solidarity in a Post-Pandemic World. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lewis.
Thank you so much, Alison. And it is such an honor and a pleasure to introduce Nancy Fraser, the Henry and Louise Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research. One of the world's leading feminist political theorists, Professor Fraser has published numerous monographs and edited volumes in the areas of social and political theory, feminist theory, and contemporary French and German thought. Some of Professor Fraser's groundbreaking publications, many of which I've had the pleasure of teaching and sharing with students at George Mason University, include Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto, Fortunes of Feminism from State-Managed Capitalism to Neoliberal Crisis, Scales of Justice, Reimagining Political Space in a Globalizing World, Mapping the Radical Imagination Between Redistribution and Recognition, Feminist Contentions, a Philosophical Exchange, and Unruly Practices, Power, Discourse, and Gender in Contemporary Social Theory. Professor Fraser's most recent book, Cannibal Capitalism, How Our System is Devouring Democracy, Care, and the Planet, and What We Can Do About It, published in 2022, examines how traditional Marxist theorists have failed to incorporate insights from feminist, ecological, and Black liberationist thought. In Cannibal Capitalism, Fraser offers a rigorous analysis of the ways in which patriarchy, white supremacy, and ecological violence are embedded within the very foundation of neoliberal capitalism. Cannibal Capitalism calls for feminist eco-socialism as a theoretical and political alternative to 21st century modes of global capitalist dysfunction and domination. The title of Professor Fraser's talk today is Three Faces of Labor, Uncovering the Hidden Ties Among Gender, Race, and Class. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fraser.
Thank you so much, Professor Lewis, for that very generous introduction. And thanks to Professor Landsberg and to Catherine Oline for organizing and inviting me. Thanks to the sponsoring departments and programs, the funding institutions. It's a great pleasure. I wanted to be able to say it's a great pleasure to be here, but I'm not exactly here in the way that I had hoped. I came down with some kind of a flu a few days ago, and I was not able to travel. But I'm delighted that it turned out to be possible to organize the lecture by Zoom, and I'm ready to give it to you. So without further ado, here we go. Let me start by saying that the concept of labor is at the center of the lecture. And some people might think that in, excuse me, in proposing that, just a minute, I need some water, which I forgot to put near me. Hold on. Okay, all set. So as I was saying, there are people who might think that by making labor, that category, the center of this sort of lecture, that I'm proposing a return to an old traditional and perhaps dépassé model of critical theorizing. One might think that I am trying to resurrect a so-called labor metaphysics, which purports to identify the single quintessentially human feature that constitutes our species being with production. If that's your impression, I have to tell you straight off the bat that you would be mistaken. My goal here, in fact, is to develop a new paradigm, a post-metaphysical paradigm, which is capable of clarifying the most pressing problems, practical problems, and political and theoretical problems that we face today in the 21st century. It's true that I will be speaking a lot about labor's place and character in capitalist society, but I want to assure you, not in the orthodox sense. My aim, quite the contrary, is to transform the concept of labor, and through that, to rethink the categories of gender, race, and class and how they relate to one another. So over the course of this lecture, all of these terms will be transformed, and I should signal that class especially will be emerging in a different guise, a new guise. Okay, but let me go back to this question about why labor. Why, you might ask, make that old-fashioned concept the starting point for rethinking gender, race, and class? Isn't it tied to a perspective that prioritizes class over gender and race? Doesn't it risk reinstating that labor metaphysics and class reductionism that dominated social theory and political practice in the past? Won't this focus lose the hard-won insights of feminists and anti-racists? Won't it take us back to the same discredited paradigm we've all worked so hard to dislodge? My answer on all counts is no, for reasons that I'll soon try to explain. But I want to tell you first what is motivating this line of inquiry. For several years now, I've been struck by the mismatch between emancipatory political engagements on the one hand and the scale of the present crisis on the other. Emancipatory engagement is plentiful and potentially powerful, it is true. It encompasses feminism, anti-racism, anti-imperialism, movements for labor and migrant rights, for social equality and livelihood security, for democracy and ecological sustainability, for peace and human rights. But these forces are fragmented and dispersed, disparate and uncoordinated. They neither coalesce around a shared project, nor constitute what Gramsci would have called a counter-hegemony. And as a result, they are overmatched by the scale of the present crisis. It's a general crisis of our whole social order, I think, one in which multiple injustices and irrationalities converge and exacerbate one another. I need only mention planetary heating and global pandemics, ballooning precarity and inequality, declining living standards and shrunken social provision, forced migration and racialized and sexualized violence, authoritarianism and persecutory scapegoating, de-democratization and militarization, and now, as if that were not bad enough, hot war on several fronts. Where is the emancipatory coalition that offers a credible response to this nexus of horribles? Where is the emancipatory coalition, the visionary breadth and practical heft that embodies a genuine alternative to the system that generates these horribles? Where is the project that could go toe-to-toe against the powers that be, against corporate neoliberalism on the one hand, and reactionary populism on the other? That is perhaps a grim diagnosis, but I am not alone in subscribing to it. On the contrary, many social justice activists and thinkers have grown dissatisfied with single issue and group specific politics. Appreciating the need for greater coordination, they are now seeking larger frameworks that can connect the dispersed struggles of multiple movements, political organizations, and labor unions. The paradigm of intersectionality, hugely popular among feminists and anti-racists, is one important marker of this aspiration. Others include the reemergence of social reproduction feminism, racial capitalism theory, eco-Marxism, and democratic socialism. All of these and more betoken a growing desire for integrative thinking and practice. My lecture today aims to advance that integrative project, although by a different route. Combining social theorizing with historical and political reflection, I'm going to offer an account of capitalist society as the common matrix that generates the social divisions of gender, race, and class, as well as their intersections. I shall trace that generative process through the lens of labor broadly conceived. Deviating from received understandings, I'll argue that capitalist society relies on three types of work. Not just exploited labor performed by free workers in exchange for wages in for-profit enterprises, but also expropriated labor, unfree or semi-dependent, coercively extracted from racialized populations who've been subjected through conquest or debt. And finally, what I'm going to call domesticated labor, also known as care and social reproductive work, chronically undervalued, often invisible, and constitutively gendered. By mapping the entwinement in capitalist society of these three faces of labor, I aim to uncover the different ties between gender, race, and class, and with them, I hope, a possible path to more coordinated emancipatory struggle. Now, the full argument for this project would require 3 steps, which complement and reinforce one another. First, we would need a structural argument that demonstrates that capitalist societies depend for internal systemic reasons on all 3 phases of labor working together. Second, we would need an historical argument which traces the shifting relations among the 3 phases over several phases of capitalist development, and which specifies for each phase who exactly is recognized as a worker and who is not, whose struggles are recognized as labor struggles and whose are not. And finally, we would need in the 3rd step a political argument which carefully considers the implications of this analysis for efforts to scale up emancipatory engagement by broadening and deepening alliances. Today's lecture, I'm going to focus on the 1st step only, namely the structural argument. I begin with W.E.B. Du Bois, who inspired this line of thought. His masterpiece, Black Reconstruction, published in 1935, offered a major new interpretation of 19th century American history and of global capitalism more broadly, an interpretation centered on labor. The book, as you know, forgive me if I'm belaboring this, but I'm not sure exactly who's in the audience. The book covers the period from 1860 to 1880, which includes the US Civil War and formal abolition of slavery, post-war Reconstruction, whose radical wing aimed to transform Southern society so as to make emancipation a reality, and finally what Du Bois called the counter-revolution of property that reestablished Black subservience and white property rule. Now, in Du Bois's view, this period was a major historical turning point in which fundamental questions about the country's future, and by extension the future of capitalism more broadly, were up for grabs. Would the outcome be a plutocracy which sanctified property, or what he called an abolition democracy which elevated labor? Du Bois thought Reconstruction prefigured the second possibility by inventing a new use for state power. It's used to elevate and empower workers, both Black and white. Its suppression was plainly catastrophic for the freed men and free women who were returned to a state close to bondage. But it also harmed poor and working class whites who lost the chance to improve their economic condition and amplify their political voice. In the event, Du Bois rightly noted, plutocracy triumphed. Du Bois's idea derives its analytic power, I think, from his conception of labor. In his view, the question of slavery was a question of labor, and anti-slavery was at bottom a labor movement, one that aimed at emancipating unfree workers, not simply by legal proclamation, but also by transforming the property system and power relations that governed their work. In other words, enslaved Black labor belonged to the same conceptual political universe as free white labor, and the radical wings of anti-slavery and Reconstruction belonged to the same conceptual universe as trade unionism and socialism. Du Bois concluded that in reality, the United States had 2 labor movements separated by color and status. Had they recognized one another and joined forces, they might have changed the course of US history and that of global capitalism. This account is revelatory, I think, because it broadens our view of what counts as labor and as a labor movement. So too does the image of 2 labor movements failing to recognize one another. What was missed, Du Bois suggests, was the possibility of an inclusive pro-working class front. Appreciating that capitalist labor assumes more than one form, such a front would recognize and embrace more than one labor movement. Failing that, it would lack the political heft and breadth of vision needed to defeat plutocracy and expand democracy. What is crucial for my purposes here is this idea of more than one kind of labor, more than one kind of labor movement. As I read him, Du Bois was not seeking to homogenize labor, to dissolve its internal differentiations into an abstract universal. Rather, he understood free and enslaved labor as distinct but structurally imbricated aspects of a single social system. Enslaved Black workers, Du Bois explained, were among the founding stones of a new industrial phase of capitalism. Producing cotton for mills throughout the North Atlantic, they kept those enterprises humming, supplying raw materials for their free counterparts to work up as commodities, and for the latter's employers to convert into profits. Black labor also served as the fulcrum for an extensive commercial nexus linking the planters, merchants, bankers, insurers, shippers, and mill owners who divided the spoils. Framing the whole process globally, Du Bois situated Southern slaves in the United States within a, and I'm quoting, dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all Africa, in the West Indies and Central America, and in the United States, that great majority of mankind on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry. Note that he says today while writing in the 1930s, and I'll return to that point shortly. Now, this is a remarkable claim which cries out to be read alongside Karl Marx's identification of the doubly free proletariat as the true creator of industrialism's marvels and as the system's eventual gravedigger. Where Marx gave pride of place to free but propertyless workers, forcibly separated from the means of subsistence and compelled to sell their labor power in exchange for wages, Du Bois foregrounds the unfree workers whose labor power is not theirs to sell, but the property of others to command by the lash. In calling them founding stones of the world capitalist system, the author of Black Reconstruction delves beneath Marx's hidden abode of factory production to an even more hidden realm on which the factory rests. It's the relation between those two realms, the factory and the plantation, that is all important. To call enslaved agricultural labor a founding stone of modern industry is to say that Black expropriation undergirds white exploitation, that the two processes are inextricably imbricated, the fates of the two groups of workers are tied together, that neither can be emancipated without the other, that two labor movements must join forces to abolish the system that generates their perverse symbiosis. This view remains pertinent today, I'm convinced. As Du Bois noted, the abolition of slavery in the US and elsewhere did not put an end to unfree expropriated labor in the capitalist world system. To this day, bonded and dependent labor continues in various guises, and it is still strongly racially marked. Might not we then view the anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles of our own time too as unrecognized labor struggles? But if so, why stop there? Why not view feminist movements too as unacknowledged struggles over work in systems built on a gendered separation of paid productive labor from unpaid and underpaid care work? Isn't that division between productive and reproductive work just as integral to capitalist society as the one Du Bois identified between expropriated and exploited labor? And if struggles to abolish prisons and defund the police, to resist ethnic cleansing and land grabs are at least in part labor struggles, as I believe they are, why not say the same about Me Too, whose chief objective, after all, is to rid the workplace of abuses of power in the form of sexual and gender harassment, coercion, and assault? Why not view campaigns for family leave, childcare, elder care, healthcare, housing, and pensions as struggles to prioritize activities that nurture people over those designed to rack up profit? And why not view campaigns for reproductive justice, including abortion access, as struggles over the conditions of reproductive work and over the status of those who perform it? Finally, why not view campaigns for the rights of migrants and domestic workers, for the unionization of nurses, health aides, teachers, office cleaners, cooks, servers, and laundry workers as struggles to revalue social reproductive labor and to empower those who perform it? In that case, this work too would be a founding stone of the global capitalist system, supplying the owners with labor, both exploitable and expropriable. Extending Du Bois's argument, then, I propose to view capitalist societies as relying on three analytically distinct but mutually imbricated forms of labor: exploited, expropriated, and domesticated. The relations among these, I claim, form the hidden ties among gender, race, and class in capitalist societies. So I endorse Du Bois's political point while also expanding it. Our current aim should be to grasp the relations among not two, but three labor movements and to evaluate prospects for uniting them. I'm going to call this project for short Du Bois plus one. Du Bois plus one rests on a distinction between the concept of labor in general and the historically specific forms that labor assumes in capitalist society. As I understand it here, labor in general means effortful social action aimed at satisfying needs, but this requires a caveat. Neither the needs that labor addresses nor the character of the labor that addresses them are given once and for all. Rather, both develop historically, as do the societies and habitats in which labor is situated, and as does the human nature of those who labor. Defined this way, labor encompasses efforts to provision human groups with food, shelter, and tools, efforts that produce useful objects. But object-producing labor presupposes other activities, which maintain natural habitats and nurture people. Those efforts of maintenance, nurture, and replenishment also count as labor. Every human society undertakes them in one way or another, along with the making of objects. In fact, object making could not exist without work that sustains the persons and habitats of those who perform it. But of course, the converse is also true. The work of nurturance could not proceed absent food, shelter, clothing, and the tools people use to fashion them. Thus, object making too is reproductive in two senses. It assures continuation, first, of human lives, and second, of the societies in which those lives are formed and lived. Seen this way, our tendency to distinguish production qua object-making labor from reproduction qua care work is problematic. By no means a universal distinction of natural kinds, it reflects historically specific arrangements that separate those activities from one another. In fact, most societies do not assign object-making and people-sustaining to separate spheres. Rather, they intermingle them freely in shared social spaces, as when peasant women take their babies into the fields and suckle them while tending their crops. In many societies, too, all these labors are understood as useful and worthy. All belong to the same social universe, even when tasks are divided by age, sex, or class. Capitalist societies are different, however. What counts as work in capitalism is employment, and that covers a relatively narrow subset of effortful, need-driven activities, those performed for and directed by employers in officially recognized workplaces in return for a salary or wage. Persons who are not employed are considered idle. Their efforts to feed themselves and their families don't count as work, even when they nurture and replenish those who are employed. Excluding activities that create non-monetized use values, this society reserves the honorific title of work for those who enter directly into the circuits of commercial exchange. Equally important, capitalism attenuates the relation between effort and need, introducing multiple intermediate steps between the expenditure of the first and the fulfillment of the second. In expending effort at their jobs, the system's designated workers satisfy their needs at best indirectly. Their labor is a means to a wage, which is in turn a means to access to means of subsistence. What gets produced, moreover, are commodities which their employers hope to sell. Far from aiming to satisfy needs directly, then, capitalists make goods as a means to making profit and to increasing their capital. The question as to whether the wares produced are otherwise useful cannot arise. The only question is whether enough people with cash are willing to buy them at a price that affords an acceptable rate of profit. The result is a convoluted system suffused with risk, lengthening the chain that is supposed to link effort and need. Capitalism plunges the relation between them into uncertainty. Each link in the chain is a point of possible breakdown, where means can fail to lead to hoped-for ends. In capitalism, then, the driving force is the relation of effort, not to need, but to accumulation. And that dynamic colors the meaning of work. The effect is to foreground activity that directly generates surplus value, paradigmatically doubly free wage labor employed in privately owned and profit-driven firms. Certainly, this labor is no picnic. Those who perform it are exploited, paid only for their necessary labor time, while the surplus value they create accrues to the capitalist. Thus, their work is Sisyphean, typically stultifying, repetitive, and heteronymous. It is free only in the thinnest sense. No wonder, then, that officially recognized capitalist labor is a major site and state of struggle in capitalist society and has been from the get-go. Nevertheless, exploited labor is only the tip of the capitalist iceberg. Beneath it lie two other genres of labor. First, what I'm calling expropriated labor, which is close to what boys call dark labor. And second, what I'm calling domesticated labor, which is close to what feminists now call care work. Expropriated and domesticated labor are both forms of shadow labor, intrinsic to capitalist society and entangled with exploited labor, but overshadowed by it, lost in the glare of the latter's presumed normativity. To say they lie beneath exploited labor is thus to say two things. First, they are founding stones in Du Bois's sense, necessary conditions for exploited labor, co-original with it, and therefore indispensable elements of the larger societal complex in which exploited labor is constituted as profitable and productive. And second, that their crucial role in that complex is systematically under-recognized and undervalued, if not wholly disavowed, by virtue of capitalism's inherent economism. And by that, I mean its systemically driven and deeply reductive equation of work with activity that advances capital accumulation by expanding what it calls value. My point, then, is that expropriated and domesticated labor are just as intrinsic to capitalist society as exploited labor. Combined with each other and with the latter, they form three interlocking pillars of one social system, analytically distinct, but internally related and mutually imbricated. Each phase of labor has its role to play in capitalist society, but the role of each is co-constituted in and through its relation to the others, and none can play its role without the others. Together, they form a nexus that powers capitalism's signature productivity and destructivity, while also inscribing gender, race, and class within it as deep-seated social differentiations and as sites and stakes of social struggle. Let me say. Expropriated labor, to start there, is unfree or dependent labor, unwaged or underwaged, coercively extracted from subjugated populations. In a sense, it's as old as the hills. We find it in one guise or another throughout human history, including in ancient empires and feudal societies, hence long before the advent of capitalism. That's doubtless why it has sometimes been considered residual, an archaic vestige of pre-capitalist society destined to fade away as capitalism matures. And yet it doesn't. We find dependent on an underwaged labor even now in prisons, brothels, sweatshops, plantations, slaughterhouses, mines, and favelas, as well as in industries that employ migrants, especially migrants without papers. The question is why? My answer is that expropriated labor has a structural basis in capitalist society. Although it's usually seen as the antithesis of exploited labor, it's better understood as one of the latter's enabling conditions. The reasons are both economic and political. Expropriated labor is cheap, this is the economic side, precisely because it's extracted from subjugated populations who've been forcibly deprived of state protections, actionable rights, and the means of self-defense. Unable to command a wage that covers their living costs, these workers supply a productive input for whose reproduction capital pays little or nothing. Firms benefit in several ways: by utilizing dependent labor directly in commodity production, by gaining access to cheap energy and raw materials produced by unfree labor somewhere else, by the availability of cheap means of subsistence, food and so on, produced in sweatshops and encomiendas, which lowers living costs and thus wages for all. By expropriating by expropriating labor from unfree subjects, then, capitalists can more profitably exploit free workers. It has been said that behind Manchester stood Mississippi. What was true in Du Bois's time remains true today. Behind Cupertino stands Kinshasa. Behind those who shop at Walmart stand those who sew in Dhaka. As Du Bois maintained, moreover, the distinction between free and dependent labor corresponds to the global color line, and that holds today as well. Who else are the expropriated now but, quoting Du Bois again, that dark and vast sea of human labor on whose bent and broken backs rests modern industry? This too is not accidental. By dividing free from unfree labor, the system also constitutes two distinct categories of persons, one suitable for mere exploitation, the other destined for brute expropriation. It thereby inscribes race as a structural fault line in capitalist society, implanting within it a host of structural injustices: racial oppression, imperialism, settler colonial apartheid, indigenous dispossession, and genocide. The common thread here is political exposure, the enforced incapacity to set limits and to invoke protections. Exposure is the deepest meaning of expropriability, the thing that sets it apart from exploitability. And it is expropriability, that is the condition of being defenseless and liable to violation, that constitutes the core of racial oppression. What distinguishes free subjects of exploitation from dependent subjects of expropriation is the mark of race as a sign of violability. Once racialized, moreover, expropriated labor is constituted as servile and menial, degraded animal toil, inferior to work that is merely exploited. However bad the latter is, the former is and must be worse. Assigned to subject people and performed in subpar conditions, it is best understood as sub-work. The expropriated sub-work of racialized others is a necessary background condition for the exploited labor of capitalism's iconic workers. Now, this Du Boisian account strikes me as right as far as it goes, but as I suggested earlier, it doesn't go far enough. To speak of a single two-tiered division within the system's producing classes misses a crucial point. Those two tiers depend on and are imbricated with a third, which I've called domesticated labor. That term signals its historic association with residential familial spaces set apart from factories and offices and formed as complements to the latter. But this work is not performed exclusively within private households, nor is it always unpaid. Rather, domesticated labor includes people nurturing and community sustaining work of many sorts, both unpaid and underpaid, and performed in a variety of different settings, from private homes, neighborhoods, and villages to public agencies, civil society associations, and increasingly today, for-profit firms. Thus, domesticated labor does not mean domestic. To call this work domesticated is rather to say that it has been tamed, historically constituted as a form of shadow work, the devalorized reproductive other of so-called productive labor. To see why, let's again distinguish the generic content of this labor from its historically specific form in our society. The generic content consists in gestating, birthing, and socializing the young, caring for the old and infirm, maintaining households, and building communities. In capitalist society, however, that content is hijacked, reformed, or rather deformed, to serve another function, to produce and replenish the populations whose labor power capital exploits and expropriates. The effect is to domesticate these activities, to form them as free gifts devoid of value. Stamped as non-work, they become the simple expression of maternal feeling or feminine instinct, merely natural, devoid of intelligence, creativity, and skill. As a result, domesticated labor too becomes cheap. Treated by capital like a natural resource, it's simply there for the taking by firms that needn't bother to replenish what they take or repair what they damage. Here too, then, capital obtains an essential condition for its so-called self-expansion well below cost. Moreover, capitalism's signature separation of productive from reproductive labor implants gender division deep within it, much as its constitutive separation of exploited from expropriated labor implants race. The effect is to entrench gender binarism. That binarism affects everyone, women and men, cis and trans, gay, straight, and queer, while casting non-cis, non-straight, non-binary people as anomalous beyond the pale. In addition, capitalism splinters domesticated labor internally. The system, as noted, needs more than one kind of labor power, not just exploitable, but also expropriable. Domesticated labor produces both types, as well as itself for that matter, albeit in different ways. When devoted to replenishing exploitable citizen workers and professional managerial strata, it is performed in part in households by relative neighbors, friends, and underpaid domestic workers, but also in social state institutions by professional or semi-professional public employees, and in for-profit firms by low-paid racialized subworkers. Things look different, however, when domesticated labor is devoted to sustaining expropriable others. In that case, it is performed in slave quarters and migrant work camps, in ghettos and on reservations, in internment and refugee camps, in favelas and open-air prisons. Doubly disavowed, that labor is tucked away out of sight, the shadow of a shadow. Yet it too is socially necessary. Insofar as capitalism requires racialized subwork, it also requires gendered, racialized subcare work. In its cheapness, domesticated labor has something in common with expropriated labor, but the two types of shadow work differ. One form is stigmatized by a race, while the other is sentimentalized by a gender. Subwork is bestialized and degraded toil unfitting a human being, which is why it is looked away from and kept at a distance. Care work, by contrast, is up close and personal, viewed through the lens of love or natural instinct, as opposed to labor, often romanticized in culture, though dishonored in practice. So, thus, the traits associated with each set of workers are not the same. Care workers should be creatures of feeling, exquisitely sensitive to others' needs, which they should prioritize over their own. while sub-workers should be thick-skinned, dumb beasts of burden who can take punches and endure pain. In effect, the first are expected to be hyper-affective, while the second must be affect-deprived. Thus, the two groups of shadow workers are differently constructed, and those amongst them for whom the system finds no use do not belong to the same reserve army of labor. For some, however, as I just mentioned, the two forms of shadow work overlap, and for reasons that are not accidental. Insofar as capitalist society requires degraded sub-work, it also requires degraded care work to produce the latter. A nasty amalgam of care work and sub-work. That work is constituted as sub-care work, and those who perform it are expected to combine traits associated with both. Like care workers, they should be finely attuned to the needs of those they care for, and like sub-workers, they should be thick-skinned, inured to the callous disregard of their own needs by bosses or masters. Here in the capitalist organization of labor, we see the social basis of one type of intersectionality, which has been much discussed by feminists. But I want to point out that there are also other types, including the historical trajectory of white male proletarians. Once dispossessed, the latter were driven to work in capitalist factories and mines for wages that did not at first cover their full living costs, and they enjoyed few actionable rights. In effect, they were constituted as hybrids whose exploitation was overlaid with expropriation. It was only through decades of concerted struggle that some of them succeeded in ridding themselves of overt markers of expropriation, and thus in advancing to pure exploitation. But that achievement has proved fragile, easily subject to reversal. Today, certainly, many of these formerly privileged workers, and how privileged they are is another matter, but many of them have been dragged back into expropriation thanks to neoliberal offshoring, financialization, flexibilization, and union busting. Equally intersectional is the trajectory of a stratum of racialized men who moved into the hybridized status their lighter-hued counterparts vacated, employed in factories, but in dirtier jobs and at lower pay, and still subject to violation by police and racist mobs. They were exploited and expropriated simultaneously. Finally, capitalist societies also produce intersections at the divides that they institute between mental and manual labor. That divide is itself a status hierarchy predicated on differential educational levels, in which so-called white-collar workers enjoy greater prestige and autonomy, if not always higher pay, than their counterparts with blue, pink, or no collars. But the status bonus is not available uniformly across the board. When racialized and/or feminized subjects perform professional managerial labor, their middle-class status is compromised. Shadowed by association with one or both forms of shadow work, they too are effectively hybrids, simultaneously exploited and expropriated and or domesticated. Well, these are just a few of the many labor-based intersections that animate capitalism's history. All of them arise from combinations of the three faces of capitalist labor. The latter are the building blocks from which such amalgams and hybrids are fabricated. They constitute the hidden intersectional ties among gender, race, and class. The key point is that these categorizations aren't systemic, as are the faces of labor to which they are tied. Race and gender divides have structural bases in capitalist society, as does empire and, of course, class. Each member of the class, race, gender triad derives its social meaning and political force from its imbrication with the others. All three are co-constituted within one social system, which forms the three phases of labor and forms the three sets of workers. Conventional understandings of the working class are therefore misleading. Analytically speaking, race and gender are not alternatives to class, but structurally grounded divisions within it. And struggles against gender and oppression can plausibly be understood as unrecognized labor struggles. Much more needs to be said about the three phases of labor, their various intersections, and the forms of social struggle to which they give rise, including struggles over who counts as a worker. We need to account both for the functional integration and the political misrecognition that has historically divided three types of workers and the intersectional hybrids constructed from them. But we also need to determine for our own time whether and how far the labor lens proposed here can embrace and clarify struggles that may seem at first glance to elude it. Struggles against indigenous dispossession, police violence, settler colonial apartheid and murder by debt, against abortion restrictions, gender binarism, and sexual assault, against planetary heating, imperial war, and forced and blocked migration. All of that is grist for future work and future discussions. Still, I hope I've said enough here today to convince you that Boyce was onto something important. Capitalist society relies on more than one face of labor and precipitates more than one type of labor movement. That perspective has since been enriched and complicated by feminist analyses of gender care work and social reproduction. By combining their insights with those of Du Bois, I have suggested that capitalist societies give rise, for non-accidental reasons, to a system-specific nexus of not two, but three faces of labor, analytically distinct, but functionally imbricated, internally related and mutually co-constituted. The effect is to uncover some hidden ties among gender, race, and class, and I think to deepen the conceptual force of the term intersectionality and to advance its political project. That project, as I view it here, is to build a counter-hegemonic political bloc that embraces the concerns of three labor movements and fosters greater coordination among them. Nothing less will suffice to transform the social system that oppresses us all. Thanks very much for your attention.